My name is Rachel, I'm 29 years old, and for 7 years I gave my family everything. When the mortgage was overdue, I paid it. When my father needed surgery, I covered the bills. When my brothers racked up debts, I bailed them out. More than $55,000 gone, but I told myself it was worth it because it meant I belonged. On Christmas night, I thought I would finally feel it sitting by the glowing tree while laughter and carols filled the room. But then the room went silent. My mother turned to me, her eyes sharp, and in front of everyone she said, "I wasn't even part of this family. Imagine the floor vanishing under you. Imagine every sacrifice reduced to nothing." That one moment burned away every illusion I had. And what I said back to her at that table is the reason you need to hear this story until the very end, because it turned a night of celebration into the night that ended it all. The snow outside thickened as the night went on, layering the street in soft white. Through the glass, I could see the faint glow of the neighbors' lights, strings of red and green blinking in rhythm. Inside, the living room glowed with a warmth that seemed to belong to everyone except me. I sat still, listening to the chatter rise and fall around me, each laugh like a reminder of how far I stood from the center of this family. Mark was telling some story about a deal at his firm, his voice loud and sure. He always had that commanding tone, the kind that made people lean in even when his stories were dull. My father nodded with pride, his eyes lighting up as if Mark's success belonged to him as well. Susan chimed in now and then, adding little details that made the story warmer. Their children were busy unwrapping early presents, paper and ribbons scattered across the rug. Across from me, Ethan laughed at something on his phone and turned it toward Mom. "Look at this," he said, showing her a video that made her shake her head and smile. He had always been the carefree one, the golden boy who got away with everything. I remembered paying off one of his parking tickets when he was still in college and another time bailing him out when he wrecked his car. No one mentioned those nights. Tonight he was just the charming youngest child, adored as always. I tried to join the rhythm of the room, nodding, smiling, even offering to refill glasses. But every time I spoke, the words seemed to fall flat, barely noticed before the conversation moved past me. I wondered if they even knew the hours I worked this month, staying late in the office until the janitors flipped off the lights, all so I could afford the extra gifts piled under this tree. When Emily toddled back to me with a candy cane, sticky fingers reaching for my hand, I felt a flicker of connection. I bent down, brushed her hair back, and told her she looked beautiful in her red pajamas. She grinned, and for a second I felt grounded. But then Helen's voice rose again, commenting on how Mark and Susan's children carried the true family charm. She didn't even glance in my direction. The words slid under my skin like cold needles. My father poured himself a second glass of wine and settled back, his laugh booming at something Ethan said. I studied his face, lined with age, and wondered if he had ever truly seen me. Growing up, I had been the steady one, the girl who did her homework without being asked, who stayed quiet while the others fought for attention. I thought maybe one day that would matter, that they would be proud. But even now at 29, I was still invisible in this house. The scent of roast turkey drifted from the kitchen, rich and heavy. Mom disappeared behind the swinging door, and I heard her voice sharp against Susan's softer one, giving instructions about the side dishes. When she returned, she smoothed her blouse again and adjusted a shiny ornament on the tree, as if the entire night hinged on perfect placement. That was when she looked at me, her smile thin and polished, and spoke the words that cut through the evening. "You never really seemed like one of us, Rachel." The words were quiet, but they echoed in my ears louder than the Christmas music. My throat tightened. I glanced around, waiting for someone to disagree, to laugh it off as a bad joke. No one did. Mark cleared his throat and reached for another drink. Susan pulled Emily onto her lap. Ethan shrugged, still glued to his phone. My father shifted in his recliner, muttering something about the game on television. I sat frozen, the cup of cider in my hand trembling until I set it down. My pulse beat hard in my neck. I thought of all the years I had covered their bills, the countless checks I had written without complaint, the vacations I never took so they could keep the house, the sacrifices I had folded quietly into my own life. And here in the middle of Christmas, with the tree glittering like a postcard, my own mother told me I was not really part of them. A hot wave of shame and anger washed over me. I wanted to stand to shout to remind them of every single time I had carried them when no one else would. But my lips stayed pressed together. The children laughed, ripping more paper from the gifts, and the moment was already passing, being smothered under false cheer. I watched Helen walk away toward the kitchen again, her heels clicking against the hardwood as if she had said nothing at all. I leaned back into the couch, my eyes drawn to the fire dancing in the hearth. My reflection in the glass window stared back at me, pale and stiff. Something shifted deep inside me, quiet but undeniable. This night, this room, this family, it would never feel the same again. I let out a slow breath, folded my arms, and sat silently as the conversations resumed without me. For the first time, I wondered if being here at all had been a mistake. The hum of their laughter faded into the background as my mind drifted somewhere else entirely, back to the winters of my childhood when the house felt just as full but my place inside it was never secure. I remembered being 10 years old, clutching a spelling bee certificate in both hands, running up the steps to show my mother. She was in the kitchen frosting cookies, her apron dusted white. I held out the certificate with pride, waiting for her to smile. She glanced at it, then at the clock, and asked if I had set the table. Mark had a basketball trophy on the counter that same night, gleaming under the light, and she stopped mid-sentence to polish it with a towel as if it were a crown. That was the rhythm of my childhood: achievement, followed by dismissal. I learned early that if I wanted attention, it had to come from something extraordinary, because average meant invisible. I studied harder than anyone I knew, poring over textbooks while Ethan played video games and Mark strutted off to his practices. When my acceptance letter from the University of Illinois came, I thought finally this would be the moment. I walked into the living room holding the envelope like treasure. Helen was on the couch with Ethan watching a movie. She read the letter out loud, then gave me a small nod and turned back to the screen. Later that evening, when Mark got a promotion at his summer job, she called the entire family into the kitchen for cake and photos. It was like that every time. Mark was the pride, the firstborn son, the one destined for greatness. Ethan was the baby, the sweet boy who could do no wrong. And me, I was just there to fill in the gaps, useful when chores needed doing or bills needed paying, but never the centerpiece. At birthdays, my gifts were practical sweaters or notebooks, while Mark got watches and Ethan got tickets to ball games. At Christmas, I often found myself setting plates in the dining room while the boys showed off whatever new gadget they had unwrapped. Helen would laugh at their antics and brush me off with a quick remark about how girls were never as strong or as clever as boys anyway. I used to sit on the staircase during family parties, knees pulled to my chest, listening to music and laughter filter through the walls. Sometimes relatives would ask why I was so quiet, and Helen would chuckle, saying girls were just more timid, not built for the same kind of spotlight. Her words etched themselves into me, making me smaller each time, until I believed maybe she was right. I thought if I worked harder, if I earned enough recognition outside these walls, I would finally be worthy inside them. My father, Richard, was softer with me. He would ruffle my hair on the way to work or slip me $1 when I needed bus fare. When he found me crying once after Helen scolded me for talking back, he sat beside me and said he was proud of me. But he never said it loud enough for her to hear. He lived in quiet agreements, keeping the peace in a house where my mother's voice ruled everything. I longed for him to stand up for me, to tell her I mattered as much as the boys, but he never did. His silence was a second wound layered over the first. By high school, I had learned to channel my hurt into achievement. Straight as leadership roles, scholarships. I told myself that success would be my shield, that one day they would have no choice but to see me. I graduated near the top of my class, with teachers telling my parents I was remarkable. Helen smiled politely at the ceremony, then spent the car ride home talking about Mark's basketball playoff. I stared out the window the entire time, holding my diploma against my chest like a secret. The University of Illinois became my escape. Campus was 2 hours away, but it might as well have been another world. There I was, not Helen's afterthought. I was Rachel, the girl who earned her place. I studied economics, spent nights in the library under buzzing fluorescent lights, and dreamed of one day living in a city where no one knew me as the shadow to her sons. Even then, though, I kept sending money home. First it was small, covering Ethan's textbooks, then larger amounts when Dad lost overtime hours at the plant. I told myself it was temporary, that it was my duty as family, that maybe this sacrifice would earn their respect. But every visit back proved me wrong. Thanksgiving dinners where I carved the turkey while Helen beamed at Mark's stories. Summer barbecues where Ethan stumbled home late and was forgiven with laughter while I was scolded for working too much. Even at Christmas, the one holiday I thought might be equal, I ended up cleaning dishes alone while the others sang carols in the living room. I would stare at my reflection in the kitchen window and wonder why I kept trying. Sitting there now as a grown woman in that same house, I felt the weight of all those years pressing down on me. Helen's careless words tonight were not new. They were the echo of every dismissal I had swallowed since childhood. Every moment I had begged silently for a recognition that never came. I pressed my fingers into the fabric of my sweater, steadying my breath. The fire crackled, the children laughed, the smell of turkey hung thick in the air. Around me the night carried on as if nothing had been said, but inside me a sharp clarity formed. I realized that from the very beginning I had been trying to prove I belonged, chasing a place that had never truly existed for me. My eyes lifted to the tree, its ornaments gleaming gold and red. Underneath the branches were the gifts I had paid for, wrapped in bright paper, waiting to be torn open. I wondered if anyone would ever understand how much of myself I had buried beneath those bows and ribbons, how many years of silence it had cost me. I let out a long breath and leaned back, listening as Mark launched into another story, Helen hanging on every word. Ethan stretched his legs across the coffee table, grinning at something on his screen. My father adjusted his glasses and nodded. I sat quietly, a grown woman who had spent her entire life yearning for a place in this family, and for the first time I began to accept the truth. Graduation in 2016 was supposed to be a beginning, the bright line where all my work finally paid off. I had the crisp suit, the offer letter from a financial firm in downtown Chicago, and the thrill of a salary that seemed almost impossible compared to the part-time jobs I had juggled in college. My first week walking the busy streets near the Loop, I felt like maybe life was tilting in my favor. But the calls started almost immediately. The first one was from my dad. His old pickup had broken down on the way to work. He sounded embarrassed, voice low, asking if I could cover the repair bill until payday. It was just over $1,000, nothing compared to what I thought I would be making. I said yes without hesitation. I wanted to be helpful, to prove I was part of the family. A week later, my mother called about the mortgage. She was short on payments, stressed about the bank notices. I wired $15,000 to stop foreclosure, my stomach tight as I pressed submit. I told myself it was temporary, just until they got back on their feet. But it was never temporary. One crisis bled into the next. Ethan needed tuition for community college, and he called me like it was a casual errand, asking for $5,000 as if I were his personal loan officer. Mark's car was about to be repossessed, and Helen insisted I step in. $7,500 disappeared from my account to rescue his pride. My father had a health scare, chest pains that led to surgery. $20,000 in hospital bills fell squarely on my shoulders because the insurance barely covered half. Then came the roof, then the furnace, each demand written like another chapter in a book I never wanted to read. By the end of that year, I had poured over $55,000 into the house I had once thought of as mine. At work, my colleagues saved for condos, vacations, and future weddings. I saved receipts of wire transfers, living in a small one-bedroom near Lakeview with peeling paint and secondhand furniture. On Fridays, when everyone went out for cocktails, I often stayed in my mind, already calculating what new request would come next. My boyfriend at the time, Marcus, tried to be patient. He had known me since college, through the long nights of studying and the dreams of a life built together. At first, he admired how dedicated I was to my family. He told me I was generous, selfless, the kind of woman anyone would be lucky to have. But as the months went on, his admiration turned to frustration. We sat across from each other in a small Italian restaurant one evening, the kind with red candles flickering in glass holders. He was quiet through most of the meal, pushing pasta around his plate, his jaw tight. Finally, he set down his fork and looked at me with tired eyes. "Rachel, when do we get to live our life?" I blinked, confused. "What do you mean?" He leaned forward, his voice low but firm. "Every time we talk about moving in together or saving for something bigger, you tell me you can't because of your family." I respect loyalty, but it feels like there's no room for us. I wanted to argue to tell him it was just a rough season, that once things stabilized we could build the life we talked about, but the truth pressed heavy on me. He wasn't wrong. My paycheck disappeared into problems that weren't mine, into people who never said thank you beyond a hurried text or a quick call. I tried to explain, tried to convince him that family obligations were temporary, that I just needed more time. Marcus shook his head. Temporary, Rach. It's been a year and a half. You don't see it, but you're disappearing into them. And I don't know if I can keep waiting for you to choose yourself. I stared at the half-eaten bread basket, my throat tight. He reached for my hand, squeezed it gently, then let go. That was the night we broke apart, the night I realized that love couldn't survive when all my energy was consumed elsewhere. After Marcus left, I threw myself even harder into work, climbing the corporate ladder one project at a time. I worked late nights, ran endless reports, and presented to executives who nodded at my precision. My managers praised me, but I rarely celebrated. Instead, I funneled my bonuses back to Evanston. Every direct deposit came with a subtraction, each raise swallowed by another need. Sometimes when I was alone in my apartment, I would open my banking app and scroll through the transactions. 15,000 here, 7,500 there, a series of numbers that told the story of my servitude. I tried to convince myself it was worth it, that I was buying loyalty, maybe even love. But deep down, a quiet ache whispered that no amount of money could purchase what I had been chasing since I was a child. One night after covering the furnace repair, I called home just to hear some gratitude. Helen picked up. I told her the payment had gone through. She said good, then asked if I could also send money for Christmas decorations. She said it like it was obvious, like of course I would take care of it. I hung up the phone and stared at the ceiling, the hum of my heater filling the silence. For the first time, the thought crept in that maybe all of this was not duty but exploitation. Still, I kept going. I told myself that families weather storms together, that sacrifice was what bound us. But when Marcus's absence echoed through my nights, when my friends celebrated milestones, while I stayed tethered to endless obligations, I wondered if I had traded my freedom for chains I had clasped myself. The realization was sharp and cold. All the money, all the years, and still I was the same girl sitting on the staircase watching the laughter from afar. I turned off the light in my apartment, lay back on the bed, and whispered into the dark that maybe sacrifice without return was not love at all. Morning always came too early in that cramped studio apartment. The thin walls let in the noise of the city buses outside, and the radiator hissed like it was fighting a losing battle against the Chicago cold. I drove my old silver Honda Civic to work every day, its heater groaning as if it was just as tired as I was. While my colleagues compared notes on weekend trips and new restaurants, I quietly adjusted my scarf and reminded myself that most of my paycheck was already spoken for before it even landed. Inside my place, the furniture was mismatched and secondhand, the mattress still on the floor, because buying a frame always felt like an indulgence. Meanwhile, the Miller house in Evanston sparkled each season with new lights, new curtains, and the warm smells of dinners bought with the money I had sent. I was paying to keep them comfortable while I lived in something closer to survival. My mother, Helen, never let me forget how little she thought of the life I had built. At Thanksgiving, while I passed around the gravy, she smirked and told Aunt Susan that Rachel works all the time, poor thing. That is why she still has no husband. Who wants a woman buried in spreadsheets? The words stung not because they were new, but because they were always the same. She could take my money but never once admit she was proud of me. The holidays turned into quiet performances. I showed up with carefully wrapped gifts, often bought with the last $100 I had after covering another emergency. They unwrapped them, smiled politely, then turned to one another with stories and inside jokes I was never part of. Mark bragged about his new promotion. Ethan laughed about nights out with friends, and Helen made sure the attention circled back to her. I became the invisible pillar holding them all up, but no one looked my way. By the time I was 27, the exhaustion had carved itself into me. I woke up with a heaviness that no amount of sleep seemed to cure. At work, my eyes blurred over numbers that once excited me. I snapped at coworkers for small mistakes, then went home and cried into my pillow because I hated becoming bitter. It was my colleague Laura who pulled me aside after another long meeting and asked if I had ever considered therapy. Her words echoed in my head for weeks until I finally sat in a softly lit office in Lincoln Park across from Dr. Patricia Chen, a therapist with calm eyes and a voice that carried both kindness and weight. She asked why I had come. I told her about the money, the family, the endless cycle that left nothing for me. My voice trembled when I admitted I felt invisible, like my entire existence was an extension of someone else's needs. Dr. Chen listened without interrupting, her pen moving only occasionally. When I finished, she leaned forward. "Rachel, you are parentified." That word startled me. She explained that children in families like mine are often forced into adult roles too early, taking responsibility for parents and siblings instead of being allowed to grow freely. "It is why you feel so tired," she said. "You have been carrying a family on your shoulders since you were a teenager." The truth hit me like cold water. I had always thought of myself as dutiful, responsible, the dependable one. Hearing it described as stolen childhood made my throat tighten. Dr. Chen asked me to remember the last time I did something purely for myself. I stared at her, realizing I could not answer. Vacations, hobbies, even relationships had all been interrupted by phone calls and obligations. My 20s had disappeared into bills and wire transfers. On the train ride home that evening, I watched the city blur past the windows and wondered what pieces of myself had been lost while I was busy saving everyone else. The laughter of college students filled the car, their backpacks slung carelessly as they made plans for concerts and dates. I sat there in my work suit, clutching my worn leather bag, feeling decades older than I actually was. At Christmas that year, I arrived at my parents' house with another envelope of money tucked in my purse. The tree was perfectly decorated, lights shimmering in gold and red stockings stuffed to the brim. My mother greeted me with a perfunctory kiss on the cheek and whispered that she hoped I had brought extra this time. The credit card bill had been heavy after all the shopping. Her tone was sweet to anyone listening, but I caught the steel beneath it. During dinner, she turned to me, wine glass in hand, and told the table that perhaps if Rachel did not spend every hour at that office, she might find someone to marry her. Mark laughed, Ethan smirked, and my father looked down at his plate. I felt my cheeks burn but forced a smile. I had grown too used to swallowing words. That night, back in my apartment, I opened the envelope I had meant to give them. For the first time, I hesitated. My therapist's words came back to me, reminding me that love was not measured in sacrifice that left nothing behind. Still, the guilt clawed at me. I placed the envelope on the counter, unable to throw it away but unwilling to deliver it. Weeks later, in another session with Dr. Chen, I confessed how torn I felt. She studied me carefully, then said that guilt is often a leash forged in families like yours. If you keep feeding it, you will never know freedom. Tears slipped down my face as I realized how tightly I had chained myself. Walking out of her office into the crisp January air, I felt something shift. For the first time, I wondered if my youth had already been traded away, not by accident, but by choice I never really had. I stood on the sidewalk, the city buzzing around me, and whispered a promise to myself that I would not spend the rest of my life invisible. The email announcing my promotion came on a cold February morning. My name sat neatly in the middle of the company-wide memo congratulating me on becoming a senior analyst at a firm in the heart of downtown Chicago. I should have felt proud, maybe even triumphant, after years of late nights and endless spreadsheets. Instead, when I walked into the office, the first words I heard were muffled laughs from the break room. Two of my male colleagues leaned against the counter with their coffees, grinning like boys in high school. One of them, Tyler, said loud enough for me to hear, "Guess it is easy to get promoted when you have no family to distract you. Single woman, no kids, no responsibilities. Of course, she can work 60 hours a week." The other chuckled and added, "Must be nice to have nothing else in life." My chest tightened, but I forced my lips into a polite smile and walked past them as if their words were just office noise. Inside, though, their voices rang like a hammer against glass. In meetings, it was no different. We were preparing for a major presentation with a prospective client that could bring millions into the firm. I had crunched the data, built the models, even drafted the strategy that would form the backbone of the pitch. Yet, when the managing director asked who would present, Tyler spoke up without hesitation. "I can handle the deck. Rachel has done the background work, but I think I should lead the room." I opened my mouth to argue, but the director clapped him on the back and said, "Perfect. Confident delivery is key. Rachel, make sure the numbers are polished." My cheeks burned as the room nodded in agreement. It was as though all my hours of labor had dissolved the moment a man volunteered to stand at the podium. I sat through the meeting with my hands folded in my lap, listening to my ideas being repackaged and claimed by someone else. The anger simmered, but I swallowed it because I knew how easily women were branded as difficult. By the time I returned to my desk, the office felt like a cage. That evening, I trudged through the slush on the sidewalks outside Union Station, my briefcase heavier than it should have been. I had barely pulled out my phone to check the train schedule when it buzzed with a message from Ethan. "Hey sis, I am behind on rent again. Can you spot me this month just until I catch up?" The words lit up the screen like a punch in the gut. My little brother was 27, fully capable of holding down a job, yet somehow he always seemed to be in crisis. I scrolled up and saw the thread of similar messages from the past year, each one asking for a bailout. My fingers trembled as I typed back, "How much?" He replied almost instantly, "800. I will pay you back." "You know I will." I laughed bitterly in the middle of the crowded platform because we both knew that promise was empty. I bought my ticket, sat on the hard plastic seat, and stared out the window as the train carried me north. The irony cut deep. In the office, I was underestimated and sidelined. At home, I was expected to shoulder everyone else's failures. There was no corner of my life where I was allowed to simply exist without carrying the weight of others. Later that night, I called Ethan. His voice was smooth, almost cheerful, as if asking me for money was no more serious than asking to borrow a book. "I cannot keep doing this for you," I said quietly. His tone hardened. "You are the one with a good job. It is not like it hurts you." I gripped the phone tighter, closing my eyes as his words sank in. It hurt me every single time. I sent the transfer anyway, then sat at my kitchen table staring at the bank app as my balance shrank again. The hum of the refrigerator filled the silence, mocking me with its steadiness while my own life spun in circles. I was being drained from both ends and no one seemed to notice, much less care. The next morning, as I rode the elevator up to the 32nd floor, Tyler and another colleague joked about how easy it must be for me to climb the ladder since I had no distractions. I kept my face blank, but inside something began to shift. Their words, combined with Ethan's demands, blended into a sharp truth. I was trapped in a loop that was never going to break unless I forced it to. That evening, back in my apartment, I opened my laptop and stared at the glowing screen. The spreadsheet of family expenses I kept updated each month stretched on like a chain. Mortgage payments I had covered, car repairs I had funded, tuition checks I had written, rent payments I had absorbed. Each line was a reminder of how thoroughly I had abandoned myself. I leaned back in my chair and rubbed my temples. My promotion, something that should have been a victory, felt like nothing more than an excuse for the world to pile more on my shoulders. My family saw me as a safety net, my colleagues as a convenient workhorse. And me, I was starting to see myself as invisible again, even after promising I would not. The clock ticked toward midnight as I closed the laptop. My chest ached with the weight of it all, but I told myself one truth before I turned out the light. If I did not change something soon, I was going to disappear entirely under everyone else's expectations. By the first week of December, the calls from my mother began, each one tinged with the same anxious tone she always used around the holidays. "Rachel, things are so tight this year," she sighed one evening as if the words were slipping out by accident. "I don't know how we're going to afford Christmas dinner, not with the mortgage, the utilities, and everything else piling up." I held the phone between my shoulder and ear as I stirred a pot of soup in my tiny kitchen. My paycheck from the promotion had barely settled into my account, and already I knew where it was going. "How much do you think it will cost, Mom?" I asked, trying to sound casual. Just the basics, she said. Turkey side dishes, drinks, maybe a little something for the grandkids' decorations too. $1,000 at least, maybe more. By the time we hung up, I was already running numbers in my head. Within the next week, I swiped my card at the grocery store, watching the total climb to nearly $1,200. A frozen turkey that barely fit into my cart, bags of cranberries, sacks of flour, and sugar, boxes of lights, ornaments, wrapping paper, and ribbon. Each beep at the register sounded like another piece of myself being given away, but I smiled at the cashier anyway. On top of that, I went out of my way to buy one gift that felt meaningful. My father had lingered over a leather jacket at Nordstrom a few months earlier, touching the sleeve with a look that was rare for him. He had never been one for indulgence, but I had seen that flicker of desire. So I saved and ordered the jacket, had it wrapped in deep green paper and tied with a gold ribbon. For once I wanted him to have something that was not a bill being paid or a crisis solved, but a gift that told him I noticed. The night before Christmas Eve, I drove to my parents' house in Evanston with the backseat loaded. The air smelled of pine and cold as I carried bags inside. My mother was already bustling in the kitchen, flour dust on her sweater. She glanced at the shopping bags and let out a sigh. "Oh, Rachel, this is too much. You didn't need to buy all this." I set the bags down carefully. "It's Christmas, Mom. I just wanted everyone to have enough." She reached into one of the bags, pulled out the wrapped jacket, and shook her head. "A leather coat, really? That's extravagant. It looks like you're trying to show off more than anything." Her words landed sharper than I expected. I swallowed, tucking a strand of hair behind my ear, and forced a small smile. "It is just something Dad will like, that's all." She didn't argue further, just turned back to the counter, but the sting lingered. I had spent weeks thinking of that gift, and in one sentence she reduced it to vanity. Upstairs, I set the packages under the tree, the lights glowing softly across the room. My sister-in-law Susan appeared in the doorway, brushing her hair back with tired hands. She gave me a small, knowing smile. "You've done a lot, Rachel. More than anyone asks out loud, but we all know." I shrugged, suddenly embarrassed. "It's fine, it's Christmas." Her eyes softened. "I just want you to be ready. Tonight and tomorrow might not be easy." My mother-in-law has sharp words, but even she doesn't compare to Helen when she decides to speak her mind. I studied her face, the flicker of caution in her eyes, and felt a knot tighten in my stomach. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, then simply said, "You'll see." Her voice was quiet, almost sympathetic, but the unease it planted grew roots quickly. I sat on the couch later, staring at the glowing ornaments, listening to the muffled sounds of my family moving through the house, and for the first time I wondered if this Christmas would not just be another cycle of giving and swallowing my hurt. Something about the way Susan had spoken made me feel as though the night ahead was already waiting to tip over. When I finally went upstairs to the guest room, I set my phone on the nightstand and tried to sleep, but the words replayed again and again. "You'll see." The air was heavy with the smell of baked pies and roasting meat, yet under it all was a tension I could not name. My hands ached from carrying bags, but what hurt more was the thought that no matter what I did, it would never be enough, never be right, never be seen for what it was. I pulled the blanket higher under my chin and stared at the ceiling. A quiet dread settled in, whispering that this Christmas would not end like all the others. The morning came with the sharp scent of cinnamon and cloves drifting from the kitchen, and I forced myself out of bed, smoothing my dress and fixing my hair as if the layers of preparation might shield me from what was waiting. Downstairs, the tree glowed brighter than ever, its lights reflecting off the ornaments we had collected over the years. Richard sat by the fireplace, already wearing the leather jacket I had given him, his hand smoothing the sleeve like it was made of gold. His smile was soft, almost boyish, and for a moment it warmed me to see him look so happy. The house was alive with sound. Mark was carrying in wine bottles, Ethan was fussing with the speaker to get the carols playing, and the children darted around in a blur of laughter and candy canes. My Aunt Carol had arrived with a tray of cookies, kissing everyone on the cheek and complimenting how grown the boys looked. She gave me a hug, warm and genuine, and for a moment I clung to it. Dinner stretched across the table like a feast from a magazine spread. The turkey was golden, the stuffing, steaming bowls of mashed potatoes and cranberry sauce lined up like soldiers. Everyone filled their plates, laughter echoing through the dining room as clinks of forks and glasses filled the air. I watched my father tear into the turkey, the jacket snug across his shoulders, and when his eyes met mine, he gave me a nod that said more than words could. That nod told me he knew at least in some quiet way what it had taken for him to wear that jacket, for all of this to be set before him. But Helen's eyes found me soon after. She lifted her wine glass with a sly smile, her voice sharp enough to slice through the music. "Rachel, I noticed you came alone again. So busy with work, I suppose no one has time to keep up with you. Nearly 30, and still nothing serious." The words dropped into the room like ice water. The laughter faltered. Forks paused midair. Even Ethan, who rarely noticed anything that wasn't about him, shifted awkwardly. Susan's gaze darted to me, pity flickering across her face, while Mark coughed into his napkin. Heat surged up my neck, my cheeks burning as every pair of eyes seemed to rest on me. I tried to steady my voice. "I came to be with family, Mom. That was the point." Helen gave a small shrug, her lips curling. Of course. I just worry, that's all. A woman should not let life pass her by." Carol broke in, her tone, cheerful but firm, trying to soften the blow. "Helen, leave her be. Rachel looks lovely tonight, doesn't she?" But the damage was done. The children had gone quiet, sensing the shift, and the warm hum of the evening had dimmed. I pushed a bite of turkey around my plate, the flavors flat in my mouth. The jacket on my father's shoulders no longer looked like triumph, but like another weight chained to me. Ethan tried to spark the mood again, cracking a joke about his job hunt and how maybe Rachel could hire him as her assistant someday. A few chuckles followed, but they were thin-strained. Susan reached under the table and gave my hand a squeeze, a small gesture that nearly undid me. I forced myself to smile, nodding along to the chatter, though my insides twisted tight. Every year I had given more, carried more, smoothed over more. And every year the spotlight found me not to celebrate but to expose. The music resumed softly. Children returned to their gifts, wrapping paper, rustling as they tore into boxes. I watched them squeal over toy trains and dolls, their joy a small shield against the heaviness settling in the room. Yet even their laughter could not mask the echo of Helen's voice in my head, circling like a taunt. Nearly 30 and still nothing serious. I picked up my glass and took a slow sip, my throat tight. Around me the family settled back into their rhythm, but I could feel the fracture, invisible yet undeniable, as if the house itself was holding its breath. The warmth of the fire flickered against the ornaments, but inside me there was only a growing silence, thick and unyielding. I sat at that table surrounded by the people I had sacrificed for, and felt more alone than I ever had in my life. And in that silence, one thought cut clear. The night was only just beginning. The fire cracked softly in the hearth, as if mocking the silence that settled over the room. Carol shifted in her chair, smoothing her skirt, while Susan reached for her glass and pretended to sip, though her hand trembled slightly. Ethan leaned back, grinning lazily, trying to reclaim the attention that had shifted away from him. He launched into another story about how his boss at the car wash always underestimated him, how he could quit anytime and start his own thing, maybe a YouTube channel or a podcast. His voice boomed through the room, trying to paper over the strange tension, and everyone chuckled politely. I smiled faintly, though the muscles in my face ached. My ears buzzed with the words my mother had dropped earlier at dinner, the sting of her jab about my single life still echoing. I focused on the tiny bubbles rising in my eggnog, willing the moment to pass. But Helen's gaze found me again. Her eyes were sharp, not softened by the glow of the Christmas tree. She set her glass down on the coffee table with a deliberate click. "You know, Rachel," she said, her voice smooth but barbed. "You've always mistaken working and throwing money around for real love." The room grew quieter, the only sound the muffled laughter of the children from the den. "You think paying bills, writing checks, buying expensive gifts makes you part of this family," she continued, "but it doesn't. Love can't be bought. And if that's all you have to offer, then maybe you never really belonged here." I felt my stomach drop, like the floor had vanished beneath me. My father leaned forward quickly, trying to stop the unraveling. Helen, it's Christmas, he said softly. Let's not do this tonight. But Helen only raised her chin, her voice gaining force. No, Richard. Tonight is as good as any. It's time someone told the truth. Rachel isn't like us. She never has been. She's not really part of this family. Her words landed like a stone thrown into still water, ripples of shock spreading across every face in the room. Carol's mouth opened in disbelief. Susan's hand shot up to her chest, her eyes darting nervously toward me. Even Ethan sat up straighter, his smirk faltering, his drink halfway to his lips. The heat rose in my cheeks, but my hand steadied on the mug. For nearly 3 decades, I had taken her slights, her comparisons, her cold dismissals. I had written checks for mortgage payments, hospital bills, tuition, car repairs. I had sacrificed weekends, vacations, and relationships, all for the sake of being seen as one of them. And here she was in front of everyone declaring that none of it mattered, that I was nothing but an outsider sitting under her roof. Richard cleared his throat again, his voice breaking slightly. Helen, please. That's not fair. But I didn't look at him. My eyes were locked on hers, the fire reflecting in her irises like sparks. If that's how you feel, I said slowly, each word measured and firm, then don't ever ask me for money again. The words sliced the air cleanly, leaving a silence so heavy it pressed on my chest. Carol gasped audibly. Mark shifted in his chair, his lips pressed in a thin line. Susan's face was frozen in shock, her hand gripping Mark's arm. Ethan stared at me wide-eyed as if he had never seen me before. Helen blinked once, her face momentarily blank. Then her lips curved downward in disdain, and she turned her head away as if the sight of me were too much to bear. I set my mug carefully on the table, my hand no longer trembling. The Christmas lights blinked steadily behind me, their cheerful glow mocking the fracture that had just split open in the center of the room. No one spoke. The laughter from the den sounded distant, out of place, a reminder that joy existed somewhere else for someone else. I leaned back against the couch, spine straight, pulse steady. For the first time in my life, I had not swallowed, my pain had not bent myself smaller to keep the peace. I had spoken a truth that could not be taken back. The weight of it settled over me, terrifying and liberating at once. My family had always thrived on my silence, on my willingness to carry what they would not. Tonight, I had dropped it at their feet. My father rubbed his forehead with one hand, his voice low. Maybe we should all take a moment, he murmured, but no one moved. I looked around the room at the people I had once bled myself dry for, and all I saw was shock, discomfort, denial. Not one voice rose in my defense. Not one person said I was wrong or right. They all just sat watching me as though waiting to see if I would take the words back. But I would not. I could not. The silence thickened until I could hear the clock ticking in the hallway, each second dragging across my nerves. I folded my hands in my lap and let the quiet stand, because this time I would not rescue them from it. The Christmas tree twinkled on, oblivious, and the night pressed forward into uncharted territory where nothing could ever return to the way it had been. Ethan was the first to react. His grin vanished and he leaned forward in his chair as if trying to steady himself. Wait, hold on, he muttered, his voice rising in panic. You don't mean that, right? I mean, you can't just stop. Mark's face had gone pale, his jaw tight, as though holding back words. Susan shifted uneasily, pulling their 2 kids closer, her arms wrapping around them as though shielding them from the tension crackling in the room. I drew in a long breath, my chest heavy, but my words sharper than ever. Over the past 7 years, I have paid nearly $55,000 to keep this family afloat. Mortgage payments, medical bills, tuition, car repairs, even the roof and the furnace. I listed each item slowly, deliberately, my eyes sweeping across the room so no one could pretend to forget. All of it came from me. And as of tonight, it's over. Carol straightened in her chair. She had always been the one to say little, her visits rare, her smile polite. But now her head bobbed, once firm and deliberate, her gaze flicking to me with something like approval. Helen's lips parted, her face twitching with the effort of holding her composure. Rachel, that's not what I meant, she said quickly, her voice suddenly thinner. You misunderstood me. I was only trying to say. No, I cut her off. You said exactly what you meant. I am not part of this family. Those were your words, and I heard them as clearly as everyone else did. Richard's hand lifted toward me, palm open, as though he could hold me in place with nothing more than air. Please, sweetheart, he said, his voice rough. Don't let this tear us apart. But the tearing had already begun, the fabric of years unraveling thread by thread. Ethan shifted forward again, his panic blooming. Come on, Rach, you can't just leave me hanging. Rent's due next week. You know I'll pay you back. I laughed once, short and bitter, the sound startling even me. You've been saying that for years. And it has never happened. Mark's voice finally broke through, quiet but edged with shame. She's right. We've leaned on her too much. Helen shot him a sharp look, betrayal flashing in her eyes. But Susan pulled at his sleeve, whispering something urgent. He turned his face away, unable to meet my gaze. I stood slowly, smoothing my dress, the weight of my decision grounding me even as my legs trembled. My coat hung on the rack near the door, and with each step toward it the silence deepened, as though the house itself was holding its breath. Rachel, wait. Richard pleaded, rising from his chair. It's Christmas. Don't leave like this. I slipped my arms into the sleeves of my wool coat, the fabric stiff from the cold outside. My fingers lingered on the buttons for a moment, my throat tight, but I did not waver. You wanted honesty, I said softly, looking back at Helen. Now you have it. The children stirred in Susan's arms, their wide eyes darting between the adults. She hushed them gently, her voice low. Helen's mouth opened again, her words faltering. I didn't mean. I was upset. You know I didn't mean it that way. But I shook my head, pulling the collar of my coat tighter around me. Once spoken words cannot be undone. Carol exhaled deeply, her eyes on me, then turned her gaze toward Helen. Maybe you should have thought of that before tonight, she said quietly, her tone carrying the weight of judgment that no one else dared voice. I reached for the door, my hand wrapping around the cold brass handle. Richard stepped closer, desperation etched into his face. Please just stay, at least until tomorrow. We can talk this out. My eyes softened at him, the one person who had ever tried, even in his silence. But I shook my head. I've talked enough. With that, I opened the door. The winter air rushed in, sharp and biting, filling my lungs with a clarity I had not felt in years. Snowflakes swirled against the porch light, drifting onto my hair and coat as though the night itself was washing me clean. Behind me, voices rose, fragments of panic and pleading, but I stepped outside and pulled the door closed gently but firmly. The muffled chaos faded into a dull hum. The world outside was quiet, snow carpeting the street, each flake glistening under the soft glow of the lampposts. My boots crunched against the icy steps, each sound marking my choice, each step carrying me farther from the weight of that house. For years I had poured myself into them, believing that love meant sacrifice without end. But tonight I saw clearly that sacrifice had only made me invisible. The cold seeped through my gloves as I pulled them tighter, my breath clouding the air before me. My car sat at the curb, a thin dusting of snow on the windshield. I brushed it off with my sleeve, the sting of the wind against my face both harsh and freeing. Behind the curtains I could see shadows, moving faces peering out, but no one came after me. Not one person stepped into the snow to stop me. I opened the car door, slid into the seat, and started the engine. The heater sputtered to life, slow to warm, but the sound of it filled the silence inside the car. For a long moment, I sat there, hands gripping the steering wheel, watching the house that had never truly felt like home. My heart pounded with a strange mix of grief and relief, the weight of years pressing down and then slowly lifting. Snowflakes tapped against the windshield, melting into tiny rivulets, blurring the glow of the Christmas lights still shining through the window. I pulled the car into gear, the tires crunching over snow, and drove down the quiet street. With every block I put between us, the knot in my chest loosened. The night was cold, the road uncertain, but for the first time the path was mine alone. Morning light spilled through the blinds in my apartment, sharp and uninvited, dragging me into the day before I was ready. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, vibrating against the wood until it tipped over. The screen lit up with my father's name. I stared at it for a long second, then let it ring until it went to voicemail. Not 5 minutes later, it lit up again, this time with Mark's number. I silenced it, but the screen glowed with his text right after. Please, Rach, call me back. I need help. I dropped the phone onto the bed and pressed my palms into my face. It had only been 3 days since Christmas, but the fallout was already circling like vultures. The phone rang again, and this time I saw Ethan's name. His voicemail followed almost immediately. His voice was cracked thin with tears. "Rach, please, they're saying I'll get kicked out if I don't pay rent by Friday. I don't have anywhere to go. Please don't do this to me." I lay back against the pillows, the ceiling above me suddenly too bright. For years I had answered every call like that. I had reached for my wallet before even asking questions. But now the silence after his words was deafening, and I realized I had nothing left to give. By the end of that morning, I had 5 missed calls from my father, 3 from Mark, and 4 from Ethan. I scrolled through the voicemails. My father's voice was measured at first, then crumbling under its own weight. "Rachel, I know your mother spoke out of turn. She regrets it. We need you. Please come back." I deleted the message before the knot in my throat could grow tighter. That afternoon, a thick envelope from Wells Fargo slid through the mail slot in my door. My name wasn't on it, but I knew what it was as soon as I saw my parents' address stamped across the front. I sat on the couch and opened it carefully, pulling out the crisp notice printed in black ink. "Past due. Final warning before foreclosure." I folded the letter slowly, my hands trembling. For years I had paid to keep that house standing. Every repair, every overdue bill, I had carried it all while they told me I didn't belong. Now the walls I had held up alone were closing in without me. The phone rang again that evening, but this time the screen showed Susan's name. I hesitated, then answered. Her voice was quiet, careful. "Rachel," I exhaled, tension leaking out of me just from hearing someone who wasn't begging. "Yes, Susan, I'm here." There was a pause on the other end, then a sigh. "I wanted to say you did the right thing." The words stopped me cold. I sat up straighter on the couch, the phone pressed tight to my ear. No one in that family had ever told me I was right, not once. Susan continued, her tone firmer now. "Mark has been hiding things from me. He told me we were fine, that his debts were under control. But yesterday I found another letter. He's months behind on payments. He's been leaning on you, so none of it showed." I closed my eyes, listening, my chest heavy. She went on. "I love him, but he needs to learn to stand on his own. And you can't be the safety net forever. You shouldn't be." For a moment, I couldn't speak. The relief that rushed through me was so sharp it almost hurt. Finally, someone saw me. Someone in that family understood the cost of what I had done. "Thank you," I whispered. The words felt small, but they were all I had. Susan's voice softened. "I know tonight isn't easy. They're going to push and plead, but don't give in. You gave more than anyone could have." We said goodbye, and I sat there long after the call ended, the phone still in my hand, my heart pounding against my ribs. For the first time, the weight on my shoulders shifted. Not gone, but lighter. The next day, the calls came again. Ethan left another tearful message swearing he'd change if I just helped him this once. Mark sent a text that was little more than a demand, his words clipped, impatient. Dad's voice broke through the line with a mix of pride and desperation, reminding me of every sacrifice he had made in his life, as if that erased the silence when I needed him most. I didn't answer. Instead, I opened my blinds and let the winter sun flood the apartment. Outside, the street was quiet, the snow on the sidewalks packed down by strangers I didn't know. The world went on, indifferent to our family chaos, and I found that comforting. For years I had believed that my family's survival depended on me, that without my money, my effort, my endless forgiveness, everything would collapse. And maybe it would. But standing at that window, I realized that collapse wasn't mine to carry anymore. My phone buzzed again on the counter. I didn't even look this time. Instead, I brewed a cup of coffee, the steam curling upward into the still air of my apartment. I wrapped my hands around the mug and let the warmth soak into me. The noise of their panic filled the phone, but here in my small space there was quiet. A quiet I had bought for myself, finally, with nothing more than the word no. And for the first time in years, the quiet felt like freedom. I booked the flight without asking anyone's opinion. 10 days in Hawaii. Just me, a suitcase with more sundresses than I probably needed, and a vow that I would not answer a single family call while I was gone. When the plane touched down in Honolulu, the air wrapped around me warm and heavy, carrying salt and flowers and something like possibility. The resort was everything the pictures had promised. Waves breaking against lava rock, palm trees swaying like dancers, the kind of turquoise water you could fall into without ever wanting to climb back out. I dropped my bag in the room, opened the balcony door, and stood there until the sun slid toward the horizon, painting the ocean in gold. Each morning started the same. Coffee on the lanai, the sound of the tide pulling against the shore, and silence that belonged only to me. I booked a spa treatment and let strangers knead years of tension out of my shoulders. I walked the beach barefoot until the soles of my feet stung. I finished 2 books that had sat unread on my shelf for years. Somewhere between the 4th and 5th day, I realized I was laughing again. Not the polite chuckle I used to offer coworkers, not the strained laugh I forced at family dinners, but a sound that came up from somewhere deep and surprised me. It startled me how long it had been gone. On the last night, I sat on the sand under a sky crowded with stars. I whispered to the ocean that I was done measuring my worth in sacrifices. For the first time in my adult life, I had lived 10 days entirely for myself, and the world had not ended. When I returned to Chicago, winter slapped me in the face at the airport doors, but I carried Hawaii inside me like armor. Back at work, the difference was immediate. My focus was sharper, my patience longer. Numbers lined up on spreadsheets without the usual blur of exhaustion. At the end of that first week back, my boss called me into his office. "You've been on fire lately, Rachel," he said, pushing his glasses up his nose. "The presentation last quarter impressed senior management. I think it's time we talk about a raise." I walked out with my heart hammering, a grin tugging at my lips. After years of pouring everything into other people, finally something was pouring back into me. It was at a financial leadership conference in Denver that I met David Parker. Tall, dark-haired, with the kind of easy confidence that comes from knowing who you are. We sat next to each other at a breakout session about risk analysis, and by the first coffee break, we were laughing like old friends. He asked about my work, really asked with interest instead of the glazed-over politeness I had grown used to. When I mentioned I had just come back from Hawaii, his eyes lit up. "I love it there," he said. "Best snorkeling of my life. Did you try the night dive with manta rays?" We ended up talking through the next session, the two of us leaning close over paper cups of bad coffee, discovering piece by piece that our lives had somehow been moving parallel without ever crossing. When he asked if I wanted to grab dinner after the conference wrapped, I didn't hesitate. That night, over pasta and wine, I realized something astonishing. I didn't feel small. I didn't feel like I had to prove my worth or apologize for who I was. With David, I felt seen. The morning after I returned home, my phone buzzed with a name I hadn't seen in years. Marcus. My thumb hovered over the screen before I answered. His voice was the same, smooth but tinged with guilt. "Rachel, I've been thinking about you. I made a mistake. You were always so strong, so steady, and I was too blind to see it. Maybe we could talk, maybe even start over." I closed my eyes and let his words wash over me, words I had once begged to hear. But now they felt thin, like paper stretched too far. "No, Marcus," I said. "I'm not the woman I was then." There was silence, heavy and stunned, before he murmured something about being sorry. I ended the call, and instead of grief, I felt only clarity. Meanwhile, the echoes of Christmas had not left my family. News filtered through in bits and pieces, sometimes from Susan, sometimes from neighbors, who still had my number. Mark's debts had multiplied, creditors circling tighter now that my money was gone. Ethan had finally been evicted, his belongings dumped on the curb of his shabby apartment complex. My mother's friends whispered behind her back the stories of foreclosure notices spreading through her church circle. Every time I heard another update, I braced for guilt. But it didn't come. Instead, there was an odd peace in knowing the truth had finally balanced. They had taken and taken and taken, and now the scales were tipping back. One evening, I lit a candle in my quiet apartment, poured myself a glass of wine, and sat by the window. The city hummed below, cars moving in streams of light. For years, I had believed karma was a myth, that sacrifice was simply the way things were. But watching my own life bloom while theirs unraveled, I understood something new. Karma wasn't a strike of lightning from the sky, it was simply the end of enabling. I took a slow sip of wine and let the quiet stretch. For once, the story wasn't theirs. It was mine. And I was finally ready to live it. Spring melted into summer, then autumn slipped into winter again, and with it came the memory of the Christmas night that had changed everything. I was no longer the same woman. My days were fuller but lighter, my laughter easier, my evenings no longer haunted by phone calls demanding help. One cold January morning my phone rang and it was Richard. His voice trembled in a way I had never heard before. "Rachel, your mother is in the hospital. It was a heart attack." The words landed heavy, and though part of me wanted to ignore them, I couldn't. No matter the years of bitterness, no matter the wounds, she was still my mother. I drove to Northwestern Memorial, the city wrapped in frost, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles whitened. When I stepped into her hospital room, the beeping machines and the pale light made her look smaller than I remembered. Helen's face was drained of color, her hair flattened against the pillow. Her eyes opened when she heard me and tears welled immediately. "Rachel," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I was wrong. All those years I was so wrong. You are not just part of this family. You are the heart of it." I stood frozen, my chest tight. For so long I had longed for those words, imagined them coming in some grand moment of reconciliation. Yet now, hearing them as she lay weak and fragile, I felt something deeper than triumph. I felt grief for the years wasted. I sat beside her and took her hand. The skin was thin, almost translucent, and I felt every tremor. We both cried quietly, the sound of our sobs filling the sterile room. "I forgive you, Mom," I said softly. "But things will not go back to the way they were. I will love you. I will stand by you, but I will not pay for everyone's lives anymore." Her fingers tightened weakly around mine, and for the first time in my memory, she did not argue. She only nodded, tears running into her hairline. The weeks that followed were slow. Helen recovered, though the heart attack left her changed. She no longer barked orders at me or scolded me for not being enough. Instead, she listened more, spoke less. Richard stopped calling me to fix things that went wrong in their house. He began managing their bills with new discipline, perhaps finally realizing the weight I had carried for so long. Mark, faced with his debts and no lifeline, took a second job at a distribution warehouse. Susan told me later that he complained endlessly at first, but something shifted when he saw his own paycheck cover their rent. Ethan found a roommate and picked up steady shifts at a diner. Aunt Carol told me she was proud of him, though she laughed about how humbled he looked carrying plates of pancakes instead of strutting around in expensive sneakers bought with my money. Even holidays changed. The next Christmas was smaller, quieter. Everyone brought a dish instead of expecting me to fund a feast. The gifts were modest, wrapped in recycled paper, but there was laughter that felt more real than all the years of shiny packages I had purchased. Susan caught me alone in the kitchen while washing dishes and said, "You saved this family, Rachel, but not in the way you think. You forced us to grow up." Her words stayed with me. One snowy evening that winter, I sat at my apartment window again, the city spread out below. I thought of that night a year before when Helen had told me I was not part of the family and how I had finally found the courage to answer. That sentence had ended something, yes, but it had also begun everything. It cut through illusion and left only truth. And with truth, we all had no choice but to change. Life is not perfect now. I still feel pangs when I see Ethan struggle, when Mark grumbles about long hours, when Helen looks older and more fragile than I want her to be. But those pangs no longer come with chains. I am no longer their savior. I am their daughter, their sister, their aunt, but also a woman with her own life, her own path, her own right to joy. Sometimes I catch myself smiling for no reason. At the office when a colleague praises my work, at dinner with David when his hand brushes mine and I feel safe. At the sound of silence in my apartment that no longer feels lonely but full. Looking back, I see that my story was never about money. It was about boundaries, about finally standing tall enough to say enough. That night under the Christmas tree when the world seemed to collapse was the night I was reborn. And as I sit here telling you this, I know some of you have felt the same pull, the same exhaustion of giving until there is nothing left. Maybe you know the pain of hearing family dismiss your worth. Maybe you know the weight of being the one who carries too much. So I ask you, have you ever had to set boundaries with your own family? Did it change you the way it changed me? Share your story in the comments. And if mine has meant something to you, hit like and subscribe so you can hear more stories like this. Stories that remind us we are not alone in choosing ourselves at last.